confirming that it was indeed Marlene's skull that had been found. Around July 2001, Bill Major was charged with his wife's murder. Once in custody, he was advised of his Miranda rights. He confirmed he understood and then went on to make a series of incriminating statements. Bill told officers that he and Marlene had got into an argument in her Ford Pinto, the only thing that had disappeared besides Marlene herself. Bill claimed that during the argument, his wife pulled a gun on him. He said he managed to get the gun away from her, but she began screaming, and in a moment of panic, he lost it and fired the gun until it was empty. After realizing his wife was dead, Bill said he left her body in her car, went to their home, grabbed the children, and took them to a neighboring house belonging to Trini Bryce. He then returned to the location where he had left his wife's body and moved her Ford Pinto to the Waller farm, where he dumped her body in a sinkhole and covered it with dirt and a piece of fencing. He then claimed to have disposed of the murder weapon in a nearby pond and pushed Marlene's car into the Ohio River. Sadly, Marlene's body, her Ford Pinto, and the murder weapon have never been recovered, despite Bill supposedly drawing a map to aid police in their search. Prior to the trial, a number of witnesses, including St. Hilaire, recalled to police having heard Major boast more than once that if Marlene ever left him, he would shoot her, cut her head off, and knock her teeth out to make identification nearly impossible. Interesting when you consider the state of the skull fragment. At Major's trial, Glenn St. Hilaire, appearing as a prosecution witness, testified that Bill carried a gun. There was an objection by the defense, but the court allowed it into evidence based upon the prosecution's assurance that later testimony would show that the gun was, at the very least, capable of producing the wounds present on the skull. St. Hilaire would go on to tell the court how 1 month prior to Marlene's disappearance, Bill had threatened his wife whilst handling a gun, saying that Marlene wasn't going anywhere. On another occasion, when St. Hilaire and Marlene were sitting together near some railroad tracks, they saw Bill going in and out of St. Hilaire's camper with a gun in his hand. Finally, Bill objected and moved for a mistrial after St. Hilaire testified that he removed Bill's .22 caliber gun from the Major's home after Marlene's disappearance. The trial court overruled Bill's motion based upon the prosecution's assertion that appropriate foundation testimony would be presented, meaning that the prosecution had to present testimony that Bill's .22 could have caused the injuries evident on the skull or had some other connection to the crime. The trial court found that weapons evidence was admissible so long as its probative value was not substantially outweighed by the risk of undue prejudice against Bill Major. Shortly after the trial court's ruling, Bill sought to exclude the weapon testimony again prior to the testimony of prosecution witness Trini Bryce. The court ruled once again that the weapon testimony was admissible. Trini Bryce was therefore permitted by the court to go on and give evidence. Bryce said that as Bill prepared to move to Rhode Island, Bill gave or sold him a few items, including a tractor, 3 guns, a CB radio, and a box of stuff which Bill asked Bryce to store in his closet for him. Another witness and former acquaintance of Bill's, David Spicer, testified that he heard Bill say he would shoot his wife, cut her up, and that no one would ever find her. When asked by the defense on cross-examination whether he thought Bill was being serious, Spicer confirmed that he did take the matter seriously because Bill, quote, carried a gun on his hip. Under cross-examination, officers who transported Bill to Kentucky from Massachusetts said that Bill told them that he had shot Marlene 6 times with a .38 caliber and that he had been fond of telling people a false tale that he was a sniper in Vietnam and that he was a prisoner of war. Another prosecution witness, Leroy Williams, testified that Bill would brag that he could perform the perfect murder. According to Williams, Bill had told him that he would shoot his victim, use the gun to knock out the teeth, cut off the feet, remove the lower jaw, and then scatter the pieces throughout the country so the victim couldn't be identified. At the conclusion of his trial, the jury deliberated for just 43 minutes before delivering a guilty verdict. Bill Major was sentenced to life imprisonment for the first offence of murder and to 5 years imprisonment for the second offence of tampering with physical evidence. In a document dated the 22nd of September 2005, William Alexander Major lodged an appeal to the Supreme Court, citing errors in his trial, specifically errors in relation to the admission of uncharged acts, the judge's failure to grant a mistrial upon the mention of the polygraph test, which he refused to take, the failure to suppress the taped telephone conversation between himself and his father, James Major, the admission of a firearm which had not been proven to be connected with the crime, the prejudicial conduct of the prosecutor during the trial, and finally, the judge's failure to grant a mistrial due to a conversation between the court bailiff and a juror. Firstly, the admission of uncharged acts. Bill Major argued that the court shouldn't have allowed the introduction of what he described as highly inflammatory character evidence of his sexual and physical abuse of his children, of his past marriages, and of child abandonment, which we will get back to in a minute, and of his prior incarceration for the sexual abuse of his children. He believed that this evidence prejudiced the jury against him and were unrelated to the charges he faced. During the trial, Donald Oakes, his son, testified about his father's sexual abuse in both Kentucky and Rhode Island around the time his mother, Marlene, disappeared. Donald testified about arguments he witnessed between his parents over the sexual abuse and about being beaten by his father after the police came around asking questions. Leilana also testified about the sexual abuse she suffered at the hands of her father. She also discussed her father's arrest in Rhode Island. You'll remember that the sexual abuse of Leilana did not begin until the family moved to Rhode Island. This was some time after Marlene's disappearance. It was held by the Supreme Court that the testimony of Donald Oakes was appropriate and admissible as it provided proof of motive. Donald's testimony about the beating he received from his father after the interview with police, the court said was, quote, an expression of a sense of guilt. However, with regards to Leilana's testimony, the court held that although it was awful, her testimony actually had no relevance to the issues involved in the murder, nor did it relate to any of the other evidence. Put simply, the court said that there was nothing in the evidence from which it could be concluded that Leilana's abuse was in any way tied to the motive for the murder of Marlene. With this in mind, it was held that the introduction of Leilana's testimony was prejudicial against Bill Major. The other evidence Bill took issue with was the evidence regarding his past marriages, his child abandonment, and his prior stints in prison. James Major, Bill's father, gave his testimony via video deposition. During his evidence, he made several references to his son's prior prison stays. For example, when asked whether his son had completed his high school education, his father confirmed that his son had got his GED in prison. He also told the court that Pauline, Bill's wife in Rhode Island, had divorced his son while he was in jail. James told the court that his son had a child by another young woman who he did not marry and who he had left to raise the child by herself, saying that Bill had failed to provide any financial support, forcing her and the child to live on welfare. James listed his son's prior marriages for the whole court to hear and testified that most recently, Bill had got a pen pal. During the trial, the prosecution questioned James about his son's arrest for sexual offences in Rhode Island in 1985, to which James replied that his son was given 15 years but got out in 10 for good behaviour. James disowned his son shortly after he was arrested. It was held by the Supreme Court that the fact of Bill's incarceration and the time of his incarceration in Rhode Island was relevant and admissible for a number of reasons. Firstly, it related back to the supposed confession Bill made to his father whilst incarcerated, which, in turn, explained the context for the whole investigation. It also explained the delay in Bill being brought back to Kentucky, and in the case of a retrial, it could be relevant to the continuing sexual abuse of Donald Oakes if such abuse was denied by Bill. However, the conviction and incarceration in Rhode Island should not be connected to the sexual abuse of Leilani. The court held that with regard to the testimony relating to Bill's marriages and the abandonment of his child, this was irrelevant to the case. It was prejudicial and therefore should not reoccur at Bill's retrial. During the trial, the prosecution questioned Florence police officer Bruce Graham about his contact with Bill Major in the week following Marlene's disappearance. Graham testified that he went to the Waller farm to talk with Bill. He advised Bill that he was still looking for Marlene and, quote, asked him if he would be willing to take a polygraph test. In the trial courtroom, defense counsel objected and no further evidence was elicited. The jury were therefore not told whether Bill had cooperated with police or not. Following a bench conference, the trial court refused to grant a mistrial and the prosecution pursued a different line of questioning entirely. No further reference was made to the polygraph test. The Supreme Court held, quote, there was no manifest necessity requiring the granting of a mistrial for this inadvertent comment in the context within which it occurred, and it was not an abuse of discretion for the court to so hold. They confirmed that the polygraph test would not be mentioned in the retrial. One of Bill Major's grounds of appeal was the admissibility of the taped phone conversation between Bill and his father, James Major. Before the trial, the defense filed a motion to suppress the taped conversation. They alleged that the conversation violated the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment rights under the U.S. Constitution and Sections 2, 10, and 11 of the Bill of Rights of the Kentucky Constitution. The motion was denied. The Supreme Court held that there had been no illegal government activity, and so the contents of the taped conversation were properly admitted into evidence. Bill Major argued that the trial court erred in permitting the prosecution to introduce the handgun, shotgun, and rifle owned by Bill in October 1980, particularly as there was no evidence that any of the firearms were involved in the murder of Marlene. The trial court at the time said the following, quote, we have upheld the admission of weapons into evidence based upon testimony that the weapon was the one used in the commission of the offence, or that it was of the same size and shape as the weapon used in the commission of the offence, or that it was found at the scene of the offence and was capable of inflicting the type of injury sustained by the victim. However, the Supreme Court held that weapons which have no relation to the crime are inadmissible, and it was therefore an error to introduce these weapons without connecting them to the crime. Bill Major requested that the Supreme Court review the prosecution's alleged misconduct in the form of crying in front of the jury during the trial. It was said that at 2 points during the trial, emotions got the better of the prosecuting attorney, who got tearful. Firstly, when examining Donald Oakes, the witness became emotional in describing what he remembered of his deceased mother. The prosecutor also became emotional. Secondly, during the sentencing argument, the prosecutor recalled how Marlene's children remembered their mother, which again brought a quiver to her voice. No objection was made at the time. The Supreme Court made the following remark, quote, trials are conducted by humans who often show indignation, anger, or sadness. This does not mean that real emotion is misconduct. The criteria by which to judge statements and actions during closing arguments is whether or not the act is inflammatory, substantially prejudiced the defense, or violated the appellant's constitutional rights. We do not find that it did. Moreover, such conduct does not qualify as palpable error. Bill's final ground of appeal was because of a conversation between a juror and the bailiff. After a prosecution witness had finished giving evidence during the trial, The judge informed the